Australia is almost the size of the United States. But its population is smaller than that of Texas. It's a country with world-class cities, strong industries, and one of the highest living standards on the planet. Yet 95% of its land is nearly empty. Most Australians live close to the coast, packed into a few narrow zones where the climate is mild and the water is reliable. While the vast interior remains a stretch of open land that few ever see. You could drive for hours, even days, without passing through a single town. There are regions as large as entire countries that only have a few thousand people. One cattle ranch covers more ground than Israel and is run by fewer than 10 workers. Despite its wealth, technology, and modern infrastructure, Australia has never filled its enormous space. Why does one of the world's largest and richest continents have so few people? What makes the rest of this country so hard to live in? The answer isn't simple. It's a mix of geology, climate, and history. That has shaped the land for millions of years. This is the story of why almost all of Australia is still completely empty. Australia is one of the strangest places on Earth when it comes to people and space. It's the smallest continent, but the only one entirely controlled by a single country. It covers nearly the same land area as the continental United States. Yet its entire population is smaller than that of Texas. While the lower 48 American states hold more than 300 million people, Australia barely reaches 26 million. California alone has around 39 million, and Texas more than 28 million. Even England, which could fit into Australia almost 30 times over, has more than double the population. Around the world, there are islands far smaller than Australia that somehow have far more people. Java in Indonesia is about 1/6 the size of Australia, yet has roughly 6 times as many residents. Other islands like Great Britain, Luzon, Sumatra, Mindanao, Honshu, and Madagascar all surpass Australia in population. That means a continent bigger than Europe without Russia has fewer people than a handful of islands scattered across the seas. If we compare it to individual cities, the contrast becomes even sharper. Tokyo's metropolitan area alone has more than 38 million people, which is already more than the entire Australian continent. Jakarta and Delhi also exceed Australia's total. Cities like Shanghai, Seoul, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, New York, Cairo, Lagos, and Mumbai all have populations roughly equal to or greater than the entire country of Australia. Imagine a whole continent with fewer people than one large city somewhere else in the world. That's how empty Australia really is. Within Australia itself, almost everyone lives in just a few coastal zones. Around 90% of the population lives in urban areas, and most of those cities are strung along the coast. The 5 main population centres, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, hold about 2/3 of all Australians. Together, Those cities make up a tiny fraction of the total land area, less than 0.25%, but they contain the majority of the nation's people. Nearly 85% of Australians live within 50 kilometers of the sea. The rest of the country, which stretches thousands of kilometers inland, is largely uninhabited. Once you leave the coast, the towns get smaller, the distances get longer, and human life quickly disappears into open space. To see how empty it gets, take the Shire of East Pilbara in Western Australia. It's roughly the same size as Japan, but home to only about 10,000 people, half of whom live in a single town called Newman. Imagine a territory the size of a major country, with the population of a small regional centre. South Australia has an even more extreme example, the pastoral unincorporated area. It's about the same size as France, but fewer than 4,000 people live there. Each person effectively has more than 100 square kilometers of land to themselves. And then there's Anna Creek Station, a privately owned cattle ranch larger than Israel, but with only 8 full-time staff managing it. In much of the interior, population density is measured in people per hundreds of square kilometers rather than people per square kilometer. Driving across the country makes the scale obvious. A trip from Esperance on the south coast to Kununurra in the north is more than 3,200 kilometers. It takes about 35 hours of driving, and across that distance, you would pass through communities totaling fewer than 70,000 people. In Europe, the same drive, say, from Madrid to Istanbul, would take you through dozens of cities and tens of millions of people. In Australia, the same distance mostly means desert, scrubland, and open road. So why is Australia so empty? Most people assume it's because the continent is basically one huge desert filled with dangerous wildlife. That's partly true, but it's far from the whole explanation. The real reasons lie in the continent's age, geography, and climate. Australia is geologically old, one of the oldest continental landmasses on Earth. It hasn't experienced large-scale mountain building or glaciation for hundreds of millions of years, so its landscape is flat and heavily eroded. The soils are ancient and depleted. There are few mountains tall enough to force moist air to rise and produce rainfall. The highest peak, Mount Kosciuszko, stands only about 2,200 meters tall, barely a hill compared to most mountain ranges in other parts of the world. Because the land is so flat, rain clouds rarely form far inland. Moist air from the oceans releases its rain along the coasts, leaving the vast interior dry. The Great Dividing Range runs down the eastern side of the continent from north to south. It acts as a barrier that traps moisture from the Pacific Ocean on the coastal side, creating fertile strips where most people live. But beyond the range, the land quickly becomes arid. This is called a rain shadow effect, and it's one of the biggest reasons most of Central and Western Australia are deserts or semi-deserts. Add to that the influence of the subtropical high-pressure belt that circles the planet around the Tropic of Capricorn. Australia sits right under that belt, where descending air warms and dries out, preventing clouds from forming. It's the same zone that creates deserts in places like the Sahara, the Kalahari, and the Arabian Peninsula. As a result, Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. The climate is also unstable. Australia is heavily affected by the El Niño and La Niña cycles in the Pacific Ocean. During an El Niño event, the ocean's warm water shifts eastward, weakening the winds that normally bring moisture to Australia. That leads to drought, heat waves, and widespread bushfires. During La Niña, the pattern reverses, and heavy rains and flooding become common. These alternating phases can each last several years. making it difficult for agriculture or rural communities to plan long-term. The combination of erratic rainfall and high evaporation rates keeps much of the continent too unpredictable for dense settlement. Even in the regions that do receive heavy rainfall, it's rarely consistent throughout the year. The north, for example, has a tropical wet and dry pattern. Darwin, the largest city in that region, gets about 1,800 millimeters of rain annually, nearly 3 times as much as London, but most of it falls between December and March. For the rest of the year, it's dry and dusty. In extreme cases, the same town might experience catastrophic flooding one year and near-desert conditions the next. Historical records show one northern community receiving more than 700 millimeters of rain in a single day during a cyclone, and then, decades later, only 4 millimeters for an entire year. Such extremes make stable farming or settlement nearly impossible without extensive infrastructure. The continent's rivers offer limited relief. The Murray-Darling Basin, in the southeast, is the largest and most important river system, supplying water for millions of people and much of the country's agriculture. Yet compared with the great rivers of the world, it's small. Its annual flow is about 24,000 gigaliters, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to the Mississippi's 530,000 gigaliters. The difference explains why Australia can't rely on its rivers the same way the United States can. During droughts, large parts of the Murray and Darling rivers dry up completely. Rising temperatures make the situation worse by increasing evaporation and reducing the snowmelt that feeds the system. As the climate continues to warm, water security becomes one of Australia's biggest challenges. Soil is another limiting factor. Much of northern and western Australia sits on land that hasn't been renewed by glaciers or volcanoes for hundreds of millions of years. Continuous weathering and erosion have stripped the nutrients from the soil, leaving it poor and infertile. Even where the land is flat and appears farmable, it often lacks the organic material and minerals needed to sustain crops. Only about 6% of Australia's land is considered arable. But because the continent is so large, that still adds up to a sizable area. The problem is that the good soil and the reliable water rarely occur in the same places. Large-scale irrigation is expensive and limited to a few river valleys, so most of the interior remains unsuitable for intensive farming. Despite these constraints, Australia does have substantial freshwater resources. By global standards, roughly 492 cubic kilometers of renewable water each year, which is more than many, much more populous countries. It also has more arable land per person than almost anywhere else on Earth. But the combination of distance, variability, and cost makes expanding settlement difficult. The infrastructure required to bring water, power, and transport to remote regions would be enormous. That's why population and economic activity remain clustered around the coasts, where conditions are more stable and access to trade routes is easy. The emptiness of the interior has become part of Australia's identity. It shapes the national image of open space, self-reliance, and isolation. The Outback is both a symbol of freedom and a reminder of the continent's limits. For most Australians, the idea of moving deep inland is unthinkable. The climate, the distance, and the lack of services make it impractical. The pattern of settlement has reinforced itself over time. More people live near the coast because that's where the jobs, water, and infrastructure already are. The physical reasons for Australia's sparse population are clear. It's a dry, flat, old continent with limited rainfall, poor soils, and vast distances between habitable areas. But those are only part of the story. The other part lies in history, how people arrived here, how the land was settled, and how government policy shaped who could come and where they could live. Geography created the limits, but human choices determined how those limits were used. The story of how Australia became a continent with so few people is closely tied to how humans arrived there and how settlement developed over time. Long before modern states existed, the first humans reached Australia tens of thousands of years ago. Archaeological evidence shows that people were living on the continent at least 50,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. At that time, sea levels were much lower, and Australia was connected to New Guinea by a land bridge known as Sahul. The first settlers likely traveled from Southeast Asia through a series of islands and then spread across the continent over thousands of years. These first inhabitants, today known as Aboriginal Australians, developed societies that were highly adapted to the local environment. They lived in small, mobile groups that moved according to the availability of food and water. In the wetter coastal and tropical areas, communities could be larger and more settled, while in the arid interior, people traveled long distances following seasonal water sources. Over tens of millennia, they built a deep understanding of the continent's patterns of drought, flood, fire, and seasonal change. Their survival in such varied and harsh conditions demonstrated that people could live across most of the continent if they were mobile and had intimate knowledge of the land. For most of human history, Australia remained isolated. While Asia, Europe, and Africa were connected through trade, migration, and empire, Australia drifted in relative seclusion. There were occasional interactions with peoples from nearby regions, such as Papua New Guinea or the islands of Indonesia, but no large-scale migrations. When sea levels rose after the last ice age about 10,000 years ago, the land bridge to New Guinea disappeared, leaving the continent even more remote. For nearly 10,000 years, the Aboriginal peoples lived without significant outside contact. The first recorded European contact came in the early 17th century. In 1606, Dutch explorer Willem Janszoon made landfall on the Cape York Peninsula in the north. Over the next century, Dutch, Portuguese, and occasionally French sailors mapped parts of the coastline, but none established settlements. The western side of the continent, where most early European ships landed, appeared barren and uninviting. Lacking fresh water and fertile soil, it was written off as unsuitable for colonization. It wasn't until 1770 that the eastern coast came to European attention. British navigator James Cook charted the coastline of what he called New South Wales and claimed it for Britain. The British saw potential in the east, with its relatively better rainfall, accessible harbours, and fertile areas near the coast. Still, it was another 18 years before Britain decided to settle there. In 1788, the first fleet arrived from England, carrying about 1,300 people, half of them convicts and the rest officers, marines, and their families. They established a settlement at Port Jackson, now Sydney. The British government's decision to use Australia as a penal colony was mainly practical. The American colonies, previously used for sending prisoners, had gained independence, and Britain needed a new place to relieve its overcrowded jails. Australia's remoteness made it ideal for that purpose. At the time of British settlement, the total Aboriginal population across the continent was likely around 600,000 to 750,000 people, scattered in hundreds of different cultural and language groups. The new arrivals were a small presence compared with the long-established indigenous peoples, yet the impact of colonization was rapid and far-reaching. European diseases, which indigenous Australians had no immunity to, spread quickly and caused large population losses. Expansion by settlers displaced many communities from their traditional lands, disrupting their food sources and social structures. For several decades, growth in the colony was slow. The early years were harsh, and supplies from Britain took months to arrive. Farming was difficult because the soil and seasons were unfamiliar. Gradually, as knowledge improved and new settlements were founded along the coast, population and agriculture began to expand. Discovery of fertile plains and reliable rivers along the east coast supported farming and grazing. Over time, settlements were established in what would become Tasmania, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia. Despite the landmass available, the population remained tiny. By 1820, about 30,000 Europeans lived in Australia. By 1850, that number had grown to around 400,000. The breakthrough came in 1851, when gold was discovered in New South Wales and Victoria. The Australian gold rush transformed the colonies. Within a decade, hundreds of thousands of immigrants, mostly from Britain, Ireland, and parts of Europe, arrived seeking fortune. Melbourne's population alone grew from around 29,000 inches of 1,851 to more than 120,000 by 1854. The gold rush not only increased numbers, but also changed how the colonies were viewed. Australia was no longer seen only as a prison settlement. It became a place of opportunity. Towns expanded, ports were developed, and railways were built to move people and goods. By the late 1800s, the total population across the colonies reached several million. Still, almost all lived along the coast or near rivers. The interior remained sparsely inhabited because the same environmental limits that existed for thousands of years still applied. When the 6 British colonies federated in 1901 to form the Commonwealth of Australia, the total population was about 3.8 million. The new nation inherited both the advantages and constraints of its geography. The coastal cities had modern infrastructure, ports, and growing industries, but inland regions were isolated and dry. Efforts were made to encourage rural settlement and farming, but droughts often forced people to abandon those ventures. Another major factor shaping Australia's population was immigration policy. At Federation, the government adopted what became known as the White Australia policy, which aimed to restrict non-European immigration. The goal was to maintain a society primarily of British descent. This policy significantly reduced migration from Asia and other regions for decades. As a result, Australia's population growth remained relatively slow compared to countries like the United States or Canada, which welcomed larger numbers of immigrants. World War I further limited growth. Around 400,000 Australians enlisted. The loss of so many young men deeply affected the small population. The interwar years brought some European migration, but numbers remained modest. During World War II, fears of invasion by Japan reinforced the perception that Australia needed a larger population to defend itself. The bombing of Darwin in 1942 and Japanese submarine attacks off the East Coast highlighted how exposed the country was. After the war, the government launched a new immigration program under the slogan, "Populate or Perish." Initially, the focus remained on attracting migrants from Britain and Northern Europe, but gradually it expanded to Southern and Eastern Europe. Between 1945 and 1965, more than 2 million immigrants arrived, including large numbers from Italy, Greece, Poland, and the Balkans. This influx helped fuel economic growth and industrial expansion in the post-war years. By the 1960s, Australia's population reached around 11 million. During that decade, the White Australia policy began to be dismantled, and by 1973, it was officially ended. From then on, immigration policy became non-discriminatory, allowing migrants from Asia and other regions to settle. This shift transformed the demographic makeup of the country. In the decades that followed, large numbers of migrants arrived from China, India, Vietnam, the Philippines, and the Middle East, creating the multicultural society seen today. Even with steady immigration, population growth has remained moderate because the starting point was so low. In 1901, Australia had fewer than 4 million people. By the 2022s, it had just surpassed 26 million. Much of this growth has been concentrated in the same coastal cities established during colonial times. Sydney and Melbourne each have more than 5 million people, while Perth, Brisbane, and Adelaide have between 1 and 3 million. Together, they still account for most of the national total. The population pattern is therefore both a result of history and geography. The first European settlements began where conditions were most favorable, near reliable water, fertile soil, and natural harbors. Infrastructure, trade, and institutions developed in those areas, reinforcing their dominance. Attempts to settle the interior faced the same barriers as always: low rainfall, limited groundwater, and extreme distances. Mining towns appeared in remote areas, but they rarely grew into large cities. Some, like Kalgoorlie or Mount Isa, remain small centers serving single industries. Modern technology has made living in remote areas easier, but not necessarily practical on a large scale. Transporting water, food, and fuel across thousands of kilometers remains expensive. Telecommunications and air travel connect the interior to the coasts, but the economic opportunities are limited compared to the major urban centers. As a result, the population continues to cluster in the same regions where it began more than 2 centuries ago. Today, nearly 1 in 3 people living in Australia was born overseas, one of the highest proportions among developed nations. Immigration continues to be a major driver of growth, with annual intakes typically between 150,000 and 200,000 people. Most newcomers settle in the major cities, adding to urban density but leaving the interior unchanged. Despite having enormous land and natural resources, the combination of climate, geography, and historical development has concentrated Australians into a few coastal zones while leaving the heart of the continent largely empty. Australia's modern prosperity is built around these realities. The country is a leading exporter of minerals, energy, and agricultural products, industries that rely heavily on vast areas of land but employ relatively few people. Urban centers handle the services, manufacturing, and administration that keep the economy running. Rural areas remain sparsely populated because the environment supports production but not large-scale settlement. Understanding why 95% of Australia is empty means recognizing both the natural and historical limits of the continent. Its harsh climate and isolation shaped early human adaptation, restricted European expansion, and continue to influence where people live today. The interior's dryness and unpredictability discourage dense settlement, while the coasts provide access to trade, water, and moderate weather. Over more than 2 centuries of modern history, these patterns have remained consistent. We will look at the challenges and opportunities this pattern creates for Australia's future. How a country that is mostly empty land must balance population growth, environmental pressures, and the realities of climate change. while deciding whether to expand inland or continue building upward along its crowded coastal rim. Australia's population today stands at around 26 million people, spread across a continent that could easily hold many times that number. Yet the factors that have always limited settlement, climate, water, geography, and distance still define how the country grows. In the coming decades, Australia faces a difficult question. How much larger can it realistically become? And what will it take to support that growth without exhausting the environment that sustains it? These are not just academic issues. They determine how Australians will live, where cities will expand, and how the country will respond to global challenges such as climate change, migration, and food security. Population projections suggest that by 2050, Australia could have between 35 and 40 million people. Most of that growth will come from immigration, as the country's birth rate remains below replacement level. Successive governments have treated migration as both an economic necessity and a way to maintain labor supply for an aging population. But the pattern of where those new residents live has not changed. Almost all settle in the existing urban corridors along the coast, particularly Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. That concentration creates new challenges in housing, infrastructure, and environmental impact. The same cities that already hold most Australians will have to absorb millions more people in the next few decades. Urban growth pressures are visible in every major city. Housing affordability is one of the most debated issues in modern Australia. Demand consistently exceeds supply in metropolitan areas, driving up prices and stretching household budgets. Efforts to build new housing push suburbs further outward, while higher density developments increase strain on transport and public services. Expanding cities also encroach on valuable agricultural land around their edges. The trade-off between providing space for people and preserving land for food production is an issue that continues to shape national planning policies. At the same time, the infrastructure that supports urban life, roads, rail, water, and energy requires continuous investment. Australia's large size and dispersed population make infrastructure expensive to build and maintain. Every additional million residents increase the load on existing systems, and the environmental footprint grows with it. Water supply is one of the most critical points. In many regions, rainfall is becoming more variable, and droughts are lasting longer. Cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth have invested in desalination plants to supplement their water sources. But desalination is energy-intensive and costly. As the population grows, managing water efficiently will be essential to avoid shortages. Climate change adds another layer of complexity. Australia is already experiencing higher average temperatures, longer fire seasons, and more extreme weather events. 9 of the 10 hottest years on record have occurred since 2005. Rising heat increases evaporation, reduces soil moisture, and stresses crops and livestock. In the Murray-Darling Basin, which supplies much of the country's food, these effects are already visible. Some sections of the river system periodically run dry, threatening irrigation, ecosystems, and regional communities. As the climate warms, rainfall patterns are expected to shift further south and east, reducing water availability in key agricultural zones. These changes directly affect food production and the economic stability of rural areas. Inland regions face the hardest challenges. The vast outback remains lightly populated, not only because of its remoteness, but also because the costs of sustaining life there are high. Transport, power generation, and access to services depend on long supply chains. For decades, governments have considered ways to encourage population dispersal away from the major cities through incentives, infrastructure projects, and regional migration programs. Yet the results have been limited. Most regional towns have grown only modestly, while the big cities continue to attract the majority of newcomers. The pattern is reinforced by economic opportunity. Industries, universities, and healthcare facilities are concentrated in metropolitan centers, creating a continuous pull toward the coast. Even so, regional Australia remains economically significant. Mining, agriculture, and energy production are vital exports, but they are not labor-intensive industries. A single mining operation can cover hundreds of square kilometers and employ only a few hundred people. Large cattle stations manage herds across areas the size of small countries with minimal staff. These sectors generate wealth, but not population growth. Automation and remote technology have reduced the number of workers needed, further limiting the potential for regional expansion. One area of opportunity is renewable energy. Australia's open spaces and abundant sunlight make it ideal for solar and wind power generation. Projects in Western Australia, South Australia, and Queensland aim to produce large amounts of renewable electricity and green hydrogen for export. These developments could create new regional hubs and stimulate infrastructure growth in areas that have long been sparsely settled. However, large-scale renewable projects also require transmission lines, storage capacity, and access to ports, which again ties back to the challenge of distance and cost. While renewable energy offers a chance to reshape parts of the interior economy, it is unlikely to lead to major population redistribution on its own. Another long-term consideration is agriculture. Australia is one of the world's top exporters of beef, wool, wheat, and wine. Its farming systems rely heavily on irrigation and groundwater management. As climate variability increases, water scarcity threatens productivity. Farmers are adopting more efficient irrigation methods and drought-resistant crops, but the limits of the environment remain firm. Expansion into marginal areas often leads to land degradation, salinity, or overuse of aquifers. Balancing food production with environmental conservation is therefore one of the central sustainability challenges for the coming century. Urban environmental management is also becoming more urgent. Cities face increasing demand for cooling infrastructure, green spaces, and public transport systems that can reduce emissions and heat buildup. As temperatures rise, energy use for air conditioning surges, adding to power demand and carbon output. Transitioning to cleaner energy sources is underway, but coal and gas still account for a large share of electricity generation. Achieving net zero emissions will require substantial investment in technology and policy coordination across all levels of government. Australia's immigration-driven growth brings both benefits and responsibilities. A larger population supports a broader economy, encourages innovation, and contributes to cultural diversity. At the same time, it magnifies the strain on housing, infrastructure, and the environment. Debates continue over what an ideal population target should be. Some economists argue for steady increases to maintain a competitive workforce, while others warn that rapid growth without adequate planning risks environmental decline and reduced living standards. Managing immigration levels has become a delicate balance between economic needs and long-term sustainability. The relationship between people and the environment in Australia has always been shaped by water. From the first Aboriginal societies to modern cities, access to reliable water sources determines where people can live and how they can thrive. For tens of thousands of years, Indigenous Australians managed the land through detailed knowledge of ecosystems, fire patterns, and seasonal cycles. Many of their practices are now being studied and reintroduced to improve land management and fire prevention. Incorporating indigenous ecological knowledge into national policy is increasingly recognized as essential for sustainable land use. Looking ahead, technology may help overcome some of the continent's natural constraints. Advances in desalination, renewable energy, remote sensing, and agriculture could make more areas viable for settlement or production. Automation allows industries like mining and logistics to operate in remote regions with fewer people on site, while improved communications make it easier to manage operations across vast distances. However, these technologies also reinforce a paradox. They allow the country to produce more with fewer people, which means the overall population distribution may not change significantly. Australia's global role is also affected by its geography. Its isolation provides security, but increases dependence on maritime trade. Nearly all imports and exports move by sea, linking the nation closely to global markets in Asia and beyond. Population growth, energy transitions, and food production are all connected to these trade relationships. Maintaining strong infrastructure and protecting coastal cities from rising sea levels will be key strategic priorities in the future. Environmental change is likely to intensify pressure on both ecosystems and people. Rising temperatures threaten coral reefs, forests, and biodiversity. Droughts and fires have already caused billions in economic losses and irreversible ecological damage. Governments at all levels are working to improve disaster response and resilience, but prevention remains a major challenge. The more the climate shifts, the harder it becomes to sustain communities in the driest parts of the continent. Planning for adaptation through water storage, renewable energy grids, and resilient housing is now central to national policy discussions. Despite the difficulties, Australia retains significant advantages. It has stable institutions, strong governance, and vast natural resources. Its cities consistently rank among the most livable in the world, offering high-quality healthcare, education, and public services. The challenge lies not in the lack of capacity, but in managing it wisely. Growth will continue, but it must be accompanied by careful planning to ensure that the country's limited water and fertile land are not overexploited. In the long term, Australia will likely remain a nation of coastal cities surrounded by immense open spaces. The interior will continue to support mining, grazing, and energy generation, but not dense populations. The combination of heat, dryness, and distance makes large inland cities impractical without massive investment. Instead, growth will occur along existing corridors, with cities expanding vertically and outward, while regional centers gradually increase in size. Technologies such as high-speed rail and renewable microgrids could connect regional areas more effectively, but they will not eliminate the environmental limits that define the continent. Ultimately, the reason 95% of Australia remains empty is not simply because people choose not to live there. It is because the natural systems that support life, water, soil, and climate constrain where large populations can survive sustainably. Overcoming those limits entirely would require changing the environment itself, which is neither feasible nor desirable. The challenge for the 21st century is to balance growth with the preservation of the unique landscapes and ecosystems that make Australia what it is. The future of Australia depends on accepting and managing that balance. The country will continue to grow through immigration, innovation, and adaptation, but its geography will keep most of that growth close to the ocean. The open interior, with its deserts, mountains, and plains, will remain mostly quiet and sparsely inhabited, a reminder of the continent's vastness and the limits of human settlement. For as long as Australia exists in its current form, it will likely remain what it has always been, a large, wealthy, and mostly empty land shaped by the extremes of its environment.